We're doing a series on Sunday nights. The title is Why God Makes Sense. And a couple of weeks ago, I tried to lay out how I want to go about this. What I'm wanting to do is have something like a conversation. And that is, how can we explain what it is that we mean by God and why it is that we believe in God in a way that will resonate, connect, click with people who are like us, interested in the world, open to ideas, but don't believe in God. There's a lot of ways to do it. And I'm not at all suggesting that the way we're going to do it is the only way to do it. But I was suggesting a different way than maybe the way some of us may have seen it done before. The way I remember being taught to do it growing up, which again is not a wrong way, is to begin with what you believe is truth. And the argument is, whether or not this makes sense to you, whether or not you buy into my assumptions, I'm going to tell you what I believe to be true. And you should thank me for telling you the truth. And the argument could be, if you don't like it, am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? That's a way. And I think that way worked better years ago when our starting assumptions as a culture were more closely aligned. The question then was, we all know that we're looking for truth. The question is, where is it? I think I told you that a Christian apologist, a man who goes to college, university places, telling them why they believe in God, and then opens the door for questions, said when he started his ministry decades ago, when it was time for questions, the questions were about truth. But now the questions are about goodness and beauty. Why are Christians so engaged in this activity that I think of as bad? Why do Christians not like me? Why, when you play out what you're telling me we're supposed to do, why, when my family did that, it just led to such ugly things? In other words, I'm interested in the beauty and the goodness questions. So, trying to connect with people, what I wanted to do this time was to talk about belief in God that starts by saying, tell me where you stand. Tell me what you think. Tell me what makes sense in your world, what's coherent, and let me see if I can draw a line from where you are closer to where I think God is. So, what I want to do tonight, is to start with a basic intuition. And I don't think I'm the only one that has it. And it goes like this. Something doesn't come from nothing. That's been my experience. Hasn't that been your experience? Things don't come into existence without reason. And I want to go at this from a couple of angles because my major professor when I was doing my doctorate was a world-class philosopher. She was not a Christian when she started her studies. She became a Christian while she was in college. And she tells her conversion story in a number of different ways, but this is one way. She says, I thought of myself as very bright. By the way, very bright people often think that about themselves. And so she said, I decided to study philosophy because everybody told me that's what the smart people do. And then I wanted to take the hardest classes. So I asked people, who's the smartest teacher on campus? And they said, that philosophy teacher, a man by the name of Norman Malcolm at Cornell. So she took him. And he was the smartest guy she had ever heard. And wouldn't you know it, he believed in God and in Jesus Christ. She couldn't figure it out. She said she would go skiing and she'd think about this. How could somebody so smart believe something so stupid? And she remembers asking him, what's the most profound question you've ever come across as a philosopher? And he would say, it's this: why is there something rather than nothing? Pretty basic intuition. The first law of thermodynamics, I remember being introduced to this in grade school, also known as the law of conservation of energy, says energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change forms. Now, what we get from that is that the total amount of mass and energy in the universe is constant. Einstein proved that. And that means that you cannot get something from absolutely nothing. Nothing cannot produce something. It explains why we can sit at our table and stare at the table wishing for a fork to appear, and it won't. If it does, we know somebody's playing a trick on us. We call it magic. When we see something, it's our basic intuition to ask, where did that come from? Because everything we can see that we describe as a secondary cause came from something else. Everything must come from something that already exists. Just let me give you an example. Try for a second to think of nothing. I bet you're thinking of something. If you're picturing total darkness, you know what darkness is? Something. And if you're thinking of nothing in a particular void, the void is something. So try to think of nothing, no thing, no space, time, existence, form, nothing. It's very, very hard to do. I am a secondary cause. That means I came from something, from someone, two people. They came from two people. They came from two people. I'll put it another way. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's what the laws tell us. It's what our observations tell us. It's what our intuitions tell us. Now, at this point, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in God, and you say, doesn't that just kind of seem like an obvious basic intuition? People tend to get defensive. Don't blame them. I would get defensive too. And the first response is, well, wait a second. You're about to stick God here somewhere, aren't you? If everything comes from something else, where did God come from? Well, it's not a bad question. But remember last week I said, you don't have to believe this. But it's interesting that when we describe God, by definition, we're describing someone who is uncaused, that has no starting point, that is eternal, that has all power and all knowledge. And you say, well, that's a nice little definition. Why don't you believe that? I haven't got there yet. What I'm saying is this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I'm saying that the ultimate cause is something that was uncaused. It has to be. But let me put it back to you. Are you telling me that this thing we're looking at called the universe is uncaused? What in the definition of what you call the universe would have the characteristics that would make sense of it being uncaused? Are you saying it's all-knowing and all-powerful and eternal without beginning or end? My intuition says since we have something, it must have ultimately come from something, and that ultimate something would have to have the characteristics of what I've always called God. Seems like a good reason to believe in God. This is my intuition. But now I want to turn to my friend and I want to say, now listen, I'm not trying to impose on you a whole different set of assumptions. So do me a favor. Go get your favorite science textbook, any one you want. I don't care if it is the standard textbook being used at your university or Oxford University or the local high school. Go pick any science textbook you want and bring it to me. We open it to the first page of Cosmology, where things come from. And you'll know that on any major basic science textbook, there is a model called the Standard Model of Cosmology. Now, you probably have never heard it called that. You've heard it called something different, something much easier to remember. Can anybody guess the more common name for the Standard Model of Cosmology? Give you a hint. Big Bang. Yep. Now, that name was actually invented by someone who absolutely hated it and was trying to say, this is a silly, silly idea, this Big Bang. And they said, oh, that sounds good. And that stuck. It's called the Standard Model. Now, what was the Standard Model 500 years ago? I don't know, but I bet you it wasn't right. What's going to be the Standard Model 500 years from now? I don't know. But remember, I'm trying to talk to somebody where they are, and I'm saying, bring to me what seems to me to be the consensus view right now of all the people you believe in, know, and trust. What does it say? Here's the Standard Model. The Standard Model says that the Earth is really, really old. I mean, really, really old. And it says the universe is even older. And then it says the universe is really big. I mean, really, really big. Staggeringly big. If you try to imagine how long it would take to get from where we are to the edge of our solar system, then you find out our solar system is just a small speck in our galaxy. Then you find out our galaxy is just one of billions and billions and billions of galaxies. Staggeringly big. Standard Model. Now, let me stop here. I suppose at this point you could say, this is all very interesting, but you need to throw this whole book in the trash can, and I want to give you a whole new set of assumptions. You can do it that way. But I'm trying a different way. I'm trying a different way in which I want to tell somebody, I really believe that truth accords with beauty, which accords with goodness, and I believe we can start at any place and draw a line which will bring us closer to understanding our need for God. So I want to start here. Suppose that you were trying to convince a Jewish person that Jesus is the Messiah. How helpful would it be to start your discussion with the book of Ephesians? They don't accept Ephesians. So Paul begins his discussion with Isaiah. Let's start with what you're reading and show you who Jesus is. So what I want to do is I want to say, if you open up your standard science textbook, your standard model, and see what it says, let's keep reading. It teaches you three things. It says it's really big and really old, but listen, it also says it's getting bigger and it's getting older. You can't get bigger, that means it's expanding. You can't get older unless at some point you were smaller and you were younger. Can anybody guess where I'm going with this? There's a third thing it tells us. The Standard Model says that there was a beginning. Go back and study Einstein back in the 1920s. He's the guy who had all chalkboards everywhere in his office, big chalkboards. And he was standing at a chalkboard, and he was putting all these equations in, and at some point he stood back and he said, wow, that'll win me a Nobel Prize. And it was this theory of relativity in which he says that if this is right, everything in the universe is expanding. 9 years later, Edwin Hubble, you ever heard of the Hubble Space Telescope? Edwin Hubble is pointing his telescope and he starts looking in all different directions, and wouldn't you know it, he had to keep shifting in order to keep up with things, and he was noticing what's called redshift, which is another way of just saying this. Try putting a bunch of dots on a balloon and then blow up the balloon. And what happens? all the dots begin to separate from each other. That's what's happening to our universe. You put all that together, and by 1960, what all the major scientists were saying is, there was a point in which everything we have that's expanding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger was all tightly packed in one place at one time and poofed into existence. In 1978, Robert Jastrow wrote a book, and he called it God and the Astronomers, and it's a strange name for a book by a guy who's an agnostic. He worked for NASA, and he said, I want to tell you something that's very disturbing. What we have discovered is that if all of Einstein's equations are right, if Hubble's studies are right, then our standard model is what it is, and if the standard model is right, there was a beginning. And I don't mean there was a moment in space and time. I mean space and time were in the bang. There was a beginning to everything. That's the standard model. Do you remember what I said before? Whatever begins to exist, what? Has a cause. And the cause can't be itself because it begins to exist. The moment you say, one thing we know for sure, this had a beginning, you are begging a very important question. So what happened? It seems to me, if we want to keep skirting the issue, we can. But I'm just using the same thing you're telling me that you believe, and I'm saying it leads you to ask a very important question. Why is there something rather than nothing? You haven't answered it. In fact, you're begging for it. If there was a beginning. And not just any answer will do. If the universe burst into existence from another universe, we would have to ask the same question, but just move it back one. And ultimately, you have to come up with either there was no beginning, which is not the standard view, or you have to say something caused it that is itself different than and greater than nature itself. But there's only two choices. There's either nature or supernature. And if nature had a beginning, it can't be the cause of itself. And if you name something else natural and say that was the cause, you haven't answered my question. We're crying out for a supernatural explanation, and Robert Jastrow says, if I need to find a word for what we're talking about, I'd call it the moment of creation. Now, if you sit down with a bunch of really smart science students, they will tell you all kinds of fun what-ifs going on right now. At the quantum level, there's theories and claims that there are some particles and antiparticles that can pop into existence in a certain kind of vacuum and last for only 1 second. And what do we do about that? A fraction of a second? What do you do about that? They're saying, well, maybe there can be a thing called the infinite regress of causes. I mean, in other words, this idea that maybe this thing was made by that, made by that, made by that, and there is no beginning to all of that. Okay. I'm just trying to start with my basic intuition, which says, at the end of all that chain, does science know of any chain of events that doesn't have a beginning? You leave science when you start asking those questions, and you enter the realm of philosophy or theology. And I just want to put this back. I want to say, if you want to conclude that the standard model is wrong and there was no beginning, infinity begat infinity, then you're describing something for which we have no scientific laws and no natural explanation. We have a word for that in theology. We call it a miracle. And what you're now calling cosmic wonder, that which can't be explained, that which gives rise to all things but can't be explained by any of our scientific method, is what I call God. So I want to add one more point before we close. It's not just that it's a neat intuition or that it matches with what is standardly held if we actually follow the conclusions. I want to talk about what's more beautiful and interesting. If there's a God, if there's supernature, who knows what I'm going to find behind the curtain? Oh, if you ask a theologian, what's going on behind the curtain? Oh, you're going to hear some stories. God and spirits and angels and demons. And there's even a story in the Bible that says there's a point where the old prophet says, God, open this kid's eyes so he can see. And the servant looks up, and behind the enemy, there's angels and chariots. Oh. I love this quote. This is from Peter Kreeft, I don't know how to pronounce it. He says, if supernaturalism is true, then there are more things in reality than in thought. Now that's the world of a poet. That's the world of a happy man who says, there's more reality than I can dream of? That's interesting. If naturalism is true, then there are more things in thought than in reality. Most of the best things I've ever thought of, I just made up. That's the philosophy of an unhappy man. Think about our big question. Why is there something rather than nothing? For the naturalist, the answer is, I don't know, but there won't be for long. But for the supernaturalist, the answer is, I only know the outskirts of answering that question. But there'll be a day when I will see him face to face. And won't that be interesting? I think I have good reason to trust my intuitions on this. I also find it beautiful and exciting and incredibly good. And I encourage you to join me in the journey. Let's pray. God, we love you and praise your name. We ask you to give us understanding. Give us opportunity to speak of the reason for our hope. Help us to always be open, always willing to learn and to trust that all true, right, good, godly, honorable, and beautiful things point back to you. May you help us to see it. In Jesus' name, amen.